Hello. My name is Rotundo. I actually just launched the game Kickstarter for my game, The Forgettable Dungeon, the other day, and in the first 24 hours, we got $3,000. And I just want to thank many of you people here who, like, a lot of you helped me by retweeting it and talking about it on social media. So yeah, it's been crazy 24 hours, and thanks.
Hello, my name is Tim. I work at Proletariat. We are currently looking for 3 types of positions. The first is a 3D artist. The second is a UI visual designer. And the third is a front-end web developer. So if you meet any of these requirements, you can check out what else is required for the positions at our website at proletariat.com/careers.
Howdy, everyone. My name is Mac. I'm running a mega game November 14th. For those that don't know, mega game is 40 players for roughly 6 hours playing a combination of board game, role-playing game, multi-minded nations, murder mystery, and puzzle hunt. It's sort of a massive, huge board gaming experience. We're actually looking for extra game weavers, people to help us run the event. And I think in our first 48 hours, we sold over half our tickets. So tickets are going fast if you want to participate as one of our team members. It's sort of an alien invasion scenario. I have some flyers up here. I'll leave them down here. If you have any questions or want to get involved, come and find me afterwards.
Hello. I can. Unusually, we have an early scheduled date for the next Boston Interactive Fiction meetup for people who are interested in old school interactive fiction or new school or Twine or any of those forms. We get together monthly at MIT and talk about what's going on in the world. The next meeting is going to be Wednesday, November 11th. The website is pr-if.org, the People's Republic of Interactive Fiction, or come to talk to me or Adria sitting over there, or Google it.
Hello, hello. How's everyone doing tonight? Good? All right. Am I the last announcement? Okay, we have like 1 or 2 more announcements. My name is Ian. I work at a really small iPhone puzzle game startup in Medford. And we're a team of about 2-3 engineers, and we're looking to pull in 1 more engineer. We really feel like there's a lot behind puzzles, so we're a little more technical, we're a little more on the sort of light artificial intelligence side of things. So if you feel like that's something you're interested in, come on down, talk to me. Probably looking for a mobile developer. If you're really gung-ho and you want to learn mobile, like we might be able to take you on and teach you. So that's pretty much it.
Hi, everyone. This is Big Mike here, right here. Woo! So, some of you might remember me as someone who's been panhandling this game for the longest time called Shock Jocks, a iPad 2-player mobile game that you play on the table. It's out now. It's on the App Store. So if you want to check, if you have an iPad, you can check that out. It's called Shock Jocks. Thank you.
Hey, I'm back. So Harmonix is hiring. We have a ton of job positions. We're looking for a UI artist, a software engineer, systems admin for IT, director of marketing, a producer in our publishing department, a product manager, senior QA. We have a ton of job positions available at Harmonix. So if you're fit one of those, come find me. Apply on our website at harmonixmusic.com, and yeah.
Hi, I'm Les Nelken. Teach at Fitchburg State University, game design program. But I'm also one of the organizers here with Don for Boston Post Mortem. And just want to say before we introduce Steve, if you get into conversations or want to talk or anything, if you can do it outside, because it'll be harder to hear all the great things that Steve's going to say. We didn't get to do this last month, but we're really happy to do this month. We probably wouldn't be here if it weren't for Steve. And I'm not saying that you should like talk to your mom about, whether he's really your father or anything like that. But Steve is one of the people that started Boston Postmortem. And so essentially, aside from seeing Steve tonight, we would probably not be meeting every month, or maybe we would be, but it wouldn't be as much fun. He started this, I don't know, Steve, how long ago was it? Steve, see here? He might have gone. I mean, he left for San Francisco a while ago, so we're sad. So Steve, it was many years ago, I don't know, it was 15 to 16 years ago, something like that. I've been on the board 11 years, so it's been around forever. Steve started it with 2 other game developers in the area, and it's been great. And now we're part of the IGDA, and my phone's reminding me to take the trash out. So, Steve, when I got my first real computer, I was really excited about 2 things: being able to do some drawing on it. So it was a Macintosh, and the other thing was to be able to play Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which is a text adventure, which is an awesome thing. And yeah, and so I didn't know that about 10 years later I would end up doing some of the first work I ever did in the game industry for Steve. I was working at Ledge Multimedia at the time, and that was a great experience. I've known Steve ever since, and blah, 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 post-mortem happened, all this sort of stuff happened. So Infocom, I don't know, the kiddies here probably haven't played a lot of these games, but some of you have. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, text adventure, Zork, Planetfall. These are the things that started Steve's career off as a game developer and made him pretty well known. He's done a ton of stuff in the meantime, including started his own game company, which is something that we had done some work for in the past. Worked at Blue Fang, Floodgate. He was definitely, one of the game gods in the local area here, and then he took off to San Francisco. We were sad, but he's been doing great there. Now he's VP of Creative at GSN, which is why we're here and why we have all the drink tickets and all that other stuff, which is great. So we're really glad to have you back at Postmortem, Steve, for at least one night, and take it away, wherever you are.
Hello. So as I said in my write-up, as I said in my write-up for the talk, the game industry can be pretty brutal. It can, not as brutal as my wife, but it can chew people up. It can spit them out heartlessly. In fact, I did a count, and of all the people who I've ever worked with in the game industry, 1,894 of them have permanently left the game industry forever. And even though I just made that stat completely up, it definitely has a real ring of truthiness about it. I think we'd all have to agree. So when I was thinking, what am I going to talk about at Postmortem that might be in some way useful and practical and not merely entertaining, I thought perhaps the lessons of how I've managed to survive for 34 years in the game industry. I mean, how is it that I, someone not particularly endowed with a very tenacious personality, have been able to survive in this industry for over a third of a century? And I think it really boils down to one word. Anyone want to guess what that word is? Okay, they start easy and they get harder. Anyway, I feel like the way that I have been able to survive for so many years is as the industry has changed, I have continued to kind of reinvent myself as a game designer, for the most part successfully, at least where successfully is defined as being able to fool bosses, publishers, VCs, etc. In fact, I only even got into the game industry through reinvention. I attended a small technical school a few blocks from here. And I didn't major in game design. There was no such thing as majoring in game design then. In fact, I didn't even major in computer science. I majored in construction project management. It kind of seemed like a good idea at the time. And after a couple of years of jobs that I hope you can't even imagine how hideously boring they were, I decided I would rather do anything, and so I became a game tester. Reinvention number one. Some folks who I knew just socially from MIT had started a game company, and my roommate, Mike Dornbrook, was their game tester, and he went off to business school. They needed a new game tester. Voila, my reinvention. And that company was Infocom. It was a spin-off from MIT's Lab for Computer Science. So I became a game tester at Infocom. In fact, you could pretty much say I became the QA department at Infocom because it was just me with an Apple II in my bedroom. And after a year, my boss, Mark Blank, said, hey, how would you like to try writing a game? And I said, sure. And then reinvention number two, I'm suddenly a game designer. Or, as we called it at Infocom, implementer. So this was my first game, Planetfall. It really did look like this, all text. You may want to avert your eyes. Even though these games were all text, in fact, we called them text adventures until our marketing department invented the term interactive fiction, which miraculously stuck and now is still used 30 years later. But, you know, even though to our eyes today, these games look visually incredibly primitive, they were really the coolest things on a computer in like the first half of the 1980s. I mean, to be able to type into your computer in full English sentences, have the game understand, and have that unspool a really deep narrative experience was just pretty incredible. Plus, as our own ad said, there were no graphics that a computer could do that were anywhere near as vivid and cool as the images that you could create in your own mind. Plus, even though our games weren't very visually stimulating, our packages were incredible. So, for example, my game Leather Goddesses of Phobos, the package included a map. It included a 3D comic book with red-blue glasses, and it included a scratch and sniff card. So my third game for Infocom, Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, was the first time I'd ever worked with licensed IP. So, you know, another big transition there. I had to learn, rather than creating my own work, how to stay close to the sort of spirit and style of the work that we were licensing. I had to make decisions about what to include, what to cut out, what new stuff to add, and especially had to figure out how to take what was a straight linear narrative and make that work within the most nonlinear of media. Also, since I was collaborating on the game with Douglas Adams, who wrote the original radio teleplay and who wrote the original novels, it was also my first time learning to be a collaborator. I had to learn the art of critiquing, the art of being critiqued, the art of compromise, and particularly the art of pulling teeth, because Douglas was the world's biggest procrastinator. I could spend an entire post-mortem talk just telling Douglas Adams procrastination stories. And like the other games that I did for Infocom, an all-text game, but as I said, you know, in 1984, this was sort of the epitome of cool on a home computer, and the game went to #1 on the bestseller lists and stayed there for almost a year. But alas, as the decade wore on, computers were starting to get more powerful in terms of what they could do visually, and the tastes of the market changed. Things started to go downhill sales-wise. Things only got worse when Infocom was acquired by Activision, as they sort of increasingly meddled and incompetently meddled in Infocom's affairs. And then finally, in May of 1989, Activision shut down Infocom. I was panicked. I knew nothing other than how to write text adventure games. I didn't know anyone in the industry. I'd never schmoozed with other people at other companies. Everyone else in the game industry, all the other companies were 3,000 miles away. I was doomed. I was never going to work again. But fortunately, 3 days after the shutdown was the third Game Developers Conference, or the second Game Developers Conference if you don't count the first one at Chris Crawford's house. And everyone was amazed when over 300 people showed up for this Game Developers Conference. Including me. I bought a last-minute ticket and went out to Santa Clara, where I again reinvented myself as Steve Meretzky, consulting designer. So I hung out a shingle. I learned how to start marketing myself, how to work with teams that were usually far, far away, how to write specs and then hand them off, often then to have no further involvement in the project. And for the next 5 years, I did design work for EA, for Activision, for Microprose, but especially for a Virginia startup called Legend Entertainment, for whom I wrote the 3 games in my Sorcerer's University trilogy. So I made the transition to graphic adventure game designer. You could still type in your commands in English sentences, but now you could also interact with the game by clicking on the image of your location. You could move around by using the compass rose, and you could even construct sentences out of giant menus of verbs and nouns. And since, these were now graphic adventures, I was now adding an art director hat as well as a game designer hat. And the first game in the trilogy sold pretty well, but after that promising start, sales deteriorated, and it seemed like not only were text adventures dead, but adventure games in general were on the way out. So the final game I did for Legend, Superhero League of Hoboken, was my first role-playing game. Or rather, it sort of combined, was a hybrid of elements of adventure game and role-playing game. So in addition to things like puzzles and narrative, I was now working with numbers and formulas and spreadsheets. Which brings us to 1994. And there was a new technology on the market, CD-ROMs, and a new buzzword, multimedia. There was a lot of money pouring into the game industry. Every movie studio, every book publisher, thought, oh my God, we've got to get in on the ground floor of this multimedia thing or we're going to get left out. It was the time of Sillywood, the sort of early unsuccessful marriage of Hollywood and Silicon Valley. And Mike Dornberg and I, and a third MIT friend of ours, Leo DaCosta, we decided we want to start a company so that we could get our hands on some of that Sillywood money. So we started Boffo Games, based in Concord, Mass. And suddenly, I was Steve Meretzky, entrepreneur. No longer merely concerned with just game designs, but also with making payroll, negotiating deals, knocking on publishers' doors, learning the art of the deal. Our first game was Hodge & Podge, which we started developing for MediaVision until that company completely and spectacularly imploded. And our game got sold off in bankruptcy court to Virgin Interactive. So that game was my first experience with what we would today call a casual game, although the term didn't yet exist in 1994. So now I was making games for people who actually didn't think it was fun to read a 180-page manual, or who didn't want their game to make them feel like an idiot. And it was my first infinitely replayable game. All the games that I had done up to this point was a game where you were meant to play the game for 30, 40, 50 hours, and then you're done, and you put it away, and you never look at it again. Now, all of a sudden, I had to make a game that was fun in really short play sessions, but was fun over and over again for perhaps hundreds of times. And it was the first game I ever did that was released on a CD. So all of a sudden, with hundredfold or more space, new horizons in graphic fidelity, and also voice acting talent for the first time. So now I was adding an audio director hat to my other hats. So the game itself was a 2-player board game with 19 embedded casual minigames. The game sold okay, but kind of disappointingly. basically Virgin Interactive marketed it exactly the same way they were marketing all their hardcore games, through the same channels, advertising through the same magazines, etc. So the game never really found its intended audience. It was really a game kind of before its time, and I would really love someday to remake this game now that, you know, the ginormous casual games market is actually there. And the next game that we did at Boffo was a return to my adventure game roots with the spacebar. So this was my first completely point-and-click adventure game. No parser input whatsoever, which of course fundamentally changes both the design and the player experience. You could only interact with what you could see, and you could see a lot, because for this game we built a 360-degree surround engine for each location, plus thousands of pages of dialogue, and my first experience working with 3D modeled graphics. And since I was still wearing an art director hat, that was quite a learning curve on this project. But after 3.5 years, we had to shut the doors on Boffo Games, and I was out of work for nearly a year, and I was desperate enough to go to work for THQ. Or rather, a Lexington-based subsidiary called GameFX, where for the first time I worked on console games. It was crazy. No keyboard, no mouse, and how far is the player sitting from the screen? Plus, I worked on an MMO. And, you know, not only a drastically new genre of game, but a completely new business model. Designing a game that's meant to monetize through subscriptions. So you need to addict the player and keep them addicted for months, if not years. But, of course, none of these games actually came out because we are talking about THQ. And after a frustrating and unproductive 1.5 years, I left there and I joined a startup in Newton called WorldWinner.com. Now part of GSN Games, but at that point, an independent company. This was my first taste of Internet 1.0. The plan was to bring skill-based cash tournaments to the web. Players could play in tournaments for free, and the winner, there was a leaderboard and a winner in every tournament. But optionally, a player could choose to enter a tournament with a cash entry fee, and if they did so, then there was a cash prize or multiple cash prizes awarded. So this was, in a very real sense, my first experience as a free-to-play game designer. In fact, I'm pretty sure that this is the first appearance of the free-to-play business model in North America at all. So I was designing to support free-to-play, where I needed to create a perfectly good experience for the player who wasn't paying, but also provide enough of a premium experience in order to encourage that few percent of players to become payers. And it was also my first experience with games as a service. Not just release and forget, but games as a living, growing, changing entity. The launch date was just the beginning and not the end. And a big part of my job included planning and building a calendar of events. And finally, it was my first experience with metrics-driven game design. So collecting data, live data, poring over reports, making tweaks based on it, seeing the effect of those changes, rinse, repeat. The games were basic casual fare, and still are. Solitaire, word games, match 3, trivia, etc. But the live service component and the metrics-driven component made working on the World Winner games and the World Winner site a really heady, almost kind of addictive experience. And when I left after 5.5 years, I really felt, you know, almost kind of a withdrawal from the excitement of live service development. And I left to join Floodgate Entertainment. This was Paul Neurath's company, the successor to Looking Glass. And he just raised a bunch of venture capital. And I found myself working on mobile games. Now, by mobile games, I'm not talking smartphones. These were primitive flip phones and the like, running Java and Brew, with screen sizes in the neighborhood of like 150 by 200 pixels. It was awful. But Floodgate's mission wasn't just to be a leader in mobile games, it was to be a leader in multiplayer mobile games. And the first game we did was Pirates of the Caribbean multiplayer for Disney Interactive. It was released in conjunction with the second Pirates of the Caribbean movie. And this was my first time designing a real-time multiplayer experience. The game did horribly. One thing was we could never really make up our mind whether we were building an RPG or a first-person shooter. But the main problem was, as with Hodgepodge, this was really a game ahead of its time. It was really, a game built for smartphones when smartphones didn't exist yet. A game built for the App Store when there was no distribution channel like that yet. And after a stint at Blue Fang, and with our kids finally out of the nest, we decided to make the big move, and we moved to San Francisco, where I went to work for a startup making games for MySpace and soon Facebook. At the time, it was called U+, but would soon be rebranded as Playdom. And I was now a social game designer, having to worry about retention and virality and monetization vectors. And I was working on games like Mobsters and Sorority Life, Social City, Gardens of Time. Then Playdom got acquired by Disney. But I'm not counting that as a reinvention because I was pretty much working on the same sort of games, on the same sort of platforms after the acquisition. And of course, the Facebook market declined, and Playdom, or as it later became known, Disney Social Games, declined even faster. And in 2013, I joined GSN Games, or rejoined, depending on how you want to count World Winner, working on apps like GSN Casino. My first time working in the casino genre, designing games for players who are perfectly happy with a game that's 100% luck-based, who are perfectly happy with a game that has virtually no player agency whatsoever. The seeming most basic and simple genre, but it's been among the most challenging work that I've ever done. And a growing share of GSN's revenue comes from smartphones and tablets. So it was my first foray into touchscreens and also the play patterns and the short play sessions of the players on those platforms. Which pretty much brings us up to date. So by this rough count, 23 career changes in 34 years, or an average of one reinvention every year and a half, which I guess makes me the Madonna of the game industry. And where will I be 5 years from now? Maybe making games for watches or other wearables? Maybe making VR games? Or neurogaming? Or maybe zero-G games for space tourism? Who knows? But enough about me. What about you? Are there any lessons here that might be gleaned from kind of my roller coaster ride of a career? So, I think the first is that change is going to happen. Can't say when, but it's a-coming. So think about your current team, your current project, your current genre, even your current business model. Good chance that a couple years from now that might all be changed. Pretty huge chance that 5 years from now that'll all be changed. So don't get too married to what you're doing and be prepared for change. 2, no matter how stable your current situation looks, you can assume that it's a temporary condition. All companies go through periods of instability and downturns, and some of them never recover from them. Except, of course, for GSN, which is incredibly stable and always will be, and you should go to work there. But every other company is doomed. It's only a matter of the time frame. So with Infocom and later with my own studio, Boffo Games, I pretty much stayed to the bitter end. I was kind of the guy who turned the lights out. And those are the 2 times in my career when I was out of work for longest and I was most panicked and most worried about ever finding a job again. Since then, sort of in the second half of my career, I've been much more inclined to leave a green pasture for an even greener one. And I think in just about every way, that's worked out better for me. So I'm not saying just jump, at every offer you get. Even if someone is offering you a little more than you're making now, think through all the ramifications of it. This new company, are you going to like the people that you're working with? Are you going to be expected to work really long hours, and how is your significant other going to feel about that? Is the company going to be around in a year when the initial VC money runs out? And of course, most important, does the new company have free food? But if on balance, the answers to these questions make it sound like jumping is the right thing to do, then by all means jump. I've certainly found that it's way nicer to be looking for a job when you have a job than to be looking for a job when you don't have a job. And when the time comes to make a change, there's no substitute for having connections. So if you recall, when I was at Infocom, I sort of was very insular from the rest of the industry, and when Infocom evaporated, I was kind of screwed because I had no connections. Now, all of you are here at post-mortem, and that's great. That shows an inclination to build bridges. And there are certainly a lot of other things you can do too. Go to conferences, speak at conferences, blog, join the IGDA, start a SIG, basically make a name for yourself in the industry. And when the inevitable change comes, don't just accept it, embrace it. You've always dreamed about working on that guild-based MMO RPG space battle game. And now you're working on a free-to-play word game. That really sucks. Where's the fun in that? There will be fun. I haven't worked on a single project at any point in my career where I wasn't able to find fun and challenging things. Very few people get to work on their dream project. Remember, you're working in your dream industry. It could be worse. You could be a construction project manager. So here's a good example. When I went to work at Worldwinner, it was these very simple games, solitaire games, match 3 games. I was like, this probably isn't going to be that interesting. I'll give it a try, but I didn't really have high hopes that I would find it fun, challenging, or interesting. But the problem of what we came to call skillifying games, so figuring out kind of how to boil out the random elements from the games and still leave the fun behind, was just an endlessly interesting and fascinating challenge. And another one was fighting cheating. Because cash was on the line, we had a huge problem with cheaters. And so coming up with ways to foil them was always something that kept my job interesting while I was at Worldwinner. And finally, drink heavily. It doesn't solve any of your problems, but it will really make all of them seem a lot better. I suggest that we start right now. So I would be glad to answer any questions from people who are willing to put off that drinking a little further. Yes, we have someone in the back who's willing to put off the drinking a little further.
You did a lot of job switching over the years. Is there anything you were doing during your downtime that would kind of invigorate you, or just
the last slide?
So the question was there anything that kept me invigorated during my job switching? And yeah, I can think of a few things. For example, Bob Bates, who is the founder of Legend and also one of the game designers at Infocom, he and I did some writing projects together, including a couple of screenplays. So that was good, particularly during some of the points in my career when I was working on games that, did not have much of a narrative component, or much of a sort of story-driven component. But no, for the most part, I do sort of the same things when I'm out of work, or, regardless of the type of job I'm in. I'm a big reader, a big movie watcher, a big game player, and, I kind of do those constantly. Yes? At GSN? Yes, I'm sure we do, or I don't think we would be sponsoring the post-mortem. I know there is a website, careers.gsn.com, which I'm sure can answer that question much better than I'm doing. Yes.
Steve, you've worked in many chapters of the gaming industry. You've been through a huge amount. Do you feel like the industry is totally different, or is it possible that throughout each chapter a little piece of something was sort of kept and then added on top of?
I mean, certainly the industry is far larger now. It's certainly far more complex now. I think, you know, there are a lot of similar strands, though. In general, the industry is still pretty amazingly fucked up. Certainly, you know, instability is a constant recurring thread. The fact that many more people want to work in gaming than there are, you know, spots to work in gaming means that companies feel like they have license to mistreat people in a lot of cases. So I think, you know, those are some of the common threads I've seen over the decades. But I'd say in terms of changes are, you know, just the growing opportunities, particularly sort of small companies, indie games. You know, there are just so many more channels now between the internet and Steam and Congregate, the App Store, Facebook. There's, you know, just lots of different ways for small projects to kind of get out and for the cream to rise to the top. And that certainly wasn't true 15 years ago.
I think I was asking more specifically in terms of game design. Were there sort of pieces that you were able to pull into, because you're in mobile now, is it a totally different game design space, or were there pieces that you pulled from previous parts of your career?
Well, I mean, they're the basics, you know, like you still want a game to be, you know, kind of a series of interesting decisions. And, you know, even in social casino, where you say, like, okay, well, that's got to be the exception because there's just no interesting decisions in social casino. But, you know, there actually are. I mean, obviously, there's the decision of which app are you going to be playing. Within an app, you know, there are often many, you know, different mini games. Even, you know, once you're in a particular, say, slot machine, there may not be any actual agency, but often there's the illusion of agency, which, you know, may substitute for agency. So, you know, I would say there are certainly bedrock principles which apply to all game design. And then beyond that, I mean, if you're designing a game with a heavy narrative component, depending on what audience you're designing for, depending on the play factor, you know, are you designing for, you know, a 1-minute experience on the genre, or are you designing for, you know, a, you know, 6-hour raid, you know, or whatever, then obviously there's huge different decisions that you need to make.
You've worked in games professionally on both coasts, the West Coast and the East Coast. What do you think is the difference between the two?
Well, it's kind of interesting. That was actually one of my first thoughts for the talk to give. And I kind of thought about it for a while, and I decided, you know, it really wasn't all that different. You know, the gaming, the industry in the Bay Area is certainly a lot larger. There are some differences. You know, there's more of a mobile focus, more of a sort of free-to-play focus in the Bay Area. I think that's changing, but, you know, certainly as of, you know, a couple years ago, it was very stark. And I'd say there's somewhat of a more entrepreneurial spirit in the Bay Area. I mean, it kind of seems like everyone is sort of dreaming of that big exit, and people are constantly leaving to start their own company and stuff like that to a higher degree than was certainly at least the case in Boston when I was here. But for the most part, you know, it's just a big roiling mix of companies and people moving from one to the other and companies going under, and it doesn't really feel all that different.
Do you think there's more of that on the West Coast? Is one of your
There's more of it because there's more companies, but the nature of it doesn't feel that different.
For the games you've worked on and the companies you work for, how do you typically find composers? Is that usually a staff position, or is that something you kind of do on a case-by-case basis, like contract?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear.
Composer, for the games you've worked on, how do you typically find your composers? Is that a staff kind of job within the company, or do you usually do it on like a case-by-case basis?
So the question is, how do we find composers? And it depends on the scale of the company. Like right now at GSN, we have an in-house full-time composer. But I'd say the vast majority of the time, it's been just something where we go out to a contractor, or there are also companies that you can contract with rather than just individuals. That was actually what we were doing before we hired this person. We were contracting with a company in the Bay Area that's quite a large and full service offering audio company.
Do you still make text pictures in your spare time? If not, why not?
I don't, and I often kind of feel that pull, but it's certainly a time-consuming activity. I mean, I know because I used to do it full time, so I have always had jobs that are pretty demanding, and therefore my free time activities need to be relatively undemanding.
I'm curious, well, actually, first off, I was a bit late, so if you already addressed this earlier, but if not, I'm curious, you mentioned in Q&A just now that the industry is very fucked up and spits people out or whatever. If optimistically you could foresee that changing, how would that change? Like, whose responsibility would that be, or what various people have to do as far as people want to get in the industry and why? Realistically, how would that change too?
So I think to summarize, basically, if the industry is fucked up, what can happen that will take it to a state in which it's not fucked up? And I'm relatively optimistic for the very long time frame. I think one thing that keeps the industry in a constant state of turmoil now is technological change. So not just sort of Moore's law and the increasing power of devices and things like that, but also sort of these major disruptive shifts from PC to console to mobile, and the appearance of social networks and those sorts of disruptive changes. I think that at some point there will come a point where those disruptive changes are not happening, or at least happening at a much slower pace, and then the industry, I think, can kind of settle down and become more mature, more professional. Another thing is, as I said, there are just sort of too many people looking for jobs in the industry, and that kind of gives companies the license to treat people badly, so I think we should just take everyone looking for jobs in the game industry and shoot every other one.
It's something that I've been meaning to ask, it's kind of bothering me, but what is the answer to life, the universe?
I can understand why you don't know the answer, because how can you see your own forehead? I was on, the question was best game I ever played. And I was on actually a panel at the GDC probably 6 or 8 years ago that was on that question. It was sort of like the 10 best games ever. And the idea was it kind of be an annual panel and kind of induct 10 games into a Hall of Fame, or it was modeled after the movie industry does the same thing, where I think they do 25 movies a year or something. And the two that I picked for that exercise were Civilization and Zork, the original Zork trilogy. Although SimCity was kind of a very close third for me. The biggest game design state? Oh, mistake. Oh, wow. That's pretty interesting. I'm not sure if this was a game design mistake, but I remember when Farmtown came out, which was the precursor to Farmville. It was basically the game that Zynga cloned to make Farmville. It was doing pretty well. It was the #1 game on Facebook, but at a very reduced level, probably 1/10 or so of the kind of level that Farmville would achieve a few months later. And I played that game and I said, oh, this game isn't going to last. No one is interested in, it's not aspirational to be a farmer. Thus, kind of keeping Playdom out of competing in the farm game genre for months longer than it would have otherwise.
I've been growing up with games from, Windows 3.1 and playing in Microsoft Paint as an artist. I was curious, as part of that rabble that is looking to enter the industry, what would you do if you were looking to position yourself to break in, with the sort of artist background?
So the question is, with an artist background, how to break into the industry. And I certainly get asked this a lot from people who want to break in as designers, so I'm sort of more familiar with that route. I would say internships are a big one. That's probably the most common entry-level point these days. Obviously, a great portfolio. So even when you're not being paid for it, just create lots of art. Different genres, will certainly help your portfolio rather than having just a single style. My art director is actually here in the back of the room. I would invite him to come up and add some things as well.
Why do you always do this to me?
Thank you, Steve. Senior art director, by the way. So some things that I would recommend, obviously a very strong portfolio showing foundations, a diversity of style, and also to some of the points that you've made, because the industry is moving so fast, I think that a lot of video game developers are looking for artists that can contribute right on day one. So having experience in the latest software, if that's for mobile games like Unity. Currently, Flash is still kind of the benchmark for Facebook games, but Flash is a great risk right now. So being current with your software, diversity of skills, diversity of style, and just not being an asshole and being a nice person. Thank you. Great presentation, by the way.
Okay, so usually what I tell people is that a good game designer is really a generalist. That you have to kind of have a little bit of knowledge about everything, and that you need to be able to get a lot of knowledge about very specific things really quickly. And you never really know what those things are going to be. Today you might be doing a game about submarines, and tomorrow you might be doing a game about Japanese mythology. And overnight you might have to become an expert on that topic. So certainly being very broadly well-read, having good curiosity, having good research skills, and playing a lot of games, but also not just playing them, but deconstructing them. So kind of being really good at looking at a game and saying what's good about it, what's bad about it, how could it be better. Those are the sort of skills you need as a game designer, and the kind of skills that you can practice before becoming a designer just as a player. Well, I mean, design is probably the toughest place to break in, because there are relatively few design positions compared to other positions within the industry, and it is, the position that the most people aspire to be. So, so it is tough. Usually, what I recommend is don't try to break in as a designer. Try to break in another discipline, and while you're already in the door at a company, try to show your interest in design, volunteer to help test, to attend brainstorming sessions, things like that, where you can kind of raise your profile and show your design abilities and your design passion. And also, similarly to with art, internships, I think, are a good way to get your foot in the door. Sure. I mean, to use an example I've already given, Civilization, you know, as a game that pretty much gets every single thing right. You know, it's certainly the canonical example of the game that you sit down to play for a little while, and then, you know, you notice the sun coming up, and you're like, holy crap. And so, you know, it just gets you in the zone. It makes you forget time. The pacing is great. You know, short-term rewards. You know, there's sort of like a phrase that I like to use is carrots all the way out to the horizon. You know, there's always like a carrot, you know, just out of reach, and then one just beyond that, and just beyond that, and just beyond that. The loops in that game are just so great and so beautifully tuned. And I don't know. I mean, I could kind of go on all night extolling Civ, but that's the one example that I would use.
In constructing a game, what do you consider good, bad, such? How do you?
Well, I would say it depends on the very specific area that you're talking about. You know, like for example, we were just talking about rewards. And so, you know, if there's sort of insufficient pacing of rewards, you feel like I've just gotten a reward and my next reward is, you know, so far away that it's not motivating me. You know, so, you know, there's sort of good and bad within almost every little kind of subsection of design. And depending on which subsection you're talking about, different definitions of good and bad. Are we done? We can drink now? Okay, so starting Boston post-mortem, there were similar things in a few other cities. Seattle was one of the first ones that had such a gathering. And for a couple years, the GDC did this thing that they called road trips, where they just had mini GDCs in different cities. I think they had one in Seattle, one in Austin, one in Boston, one in LA. And so there was one here, it was at the Heinz, and they, you know, were taking submissions, and I submitted a talk called Let's Get Organized. You know, it was basically, let's create just a regular monthly gathering. And 30 or 40 people showed up to the session. We kind of brainstormed what that might look like. Everyone threw in a business card. We used that to start a mailing list. And that's basically how Postmortem got started. I wanted to create a gathering, and I guess, you know, you can kind of argue about, does community and gathering mean two different things, or are they just two shadows of the same thing? No, it was to drink, yeah. Yeah, excuse to drink, yeah. The hardest to play, the hardest to win? Oh, the hardest I worked on. Well, I mean, easy to say the longest period I've worked on a game, but in terms of kind of like the hardest, you know, like if you just took an average day from the project, I think it probably would be a game I did at Infocom called A Mind Forever Voyaging, which was, it was the first game we did, we called it Interactive Fiction Plus. And instead of requiring 128K of memory, it required 256K of memory, which was enormous then, you know, because by going to 256K of memory, we cut out like 2/3 of the market. But because that game was so much larger than, you know, any game that I had written before, but I didn't get more time to work on it. And so as a result, I kind of crunched around the clock for many months to get that done. I don't know. Probably if I could answer that question, then I would be a great game designer.
I think that's why he's asking. What was the first platform for Zork? Was it PDP-11?
Well, the first platform for the original Zork trilogy was the ARPANET. You know, it was basically that early precursor of the internet, and you know, could be played on any mainframe that was connected to the ARPANET. But then when Infocom got started and the original mainframe Zork got broken up into Zork 1, 2, and 3. The very first one released was actually TRS-80 Model 1. Yeah.
Having such a colorful career lasting for 34 years in the game design industry and seeing it evolve to where it is today, where do you see games going or being 5 years from now or 2 years from now?
It's really hard to answer that question, except I think the one thing that's for sure is game art will be automated and we'll finally be able to get rid of all game artists.
Where do you see yourself in 5, 10, 15 years?
Oh, 6 feet under.
If you weren't doing games, what would you be doing?
I would definitely be lying on a beach in, either the Caribbean or the South Seas. Yeah, that's an easy one.
This is related back to where you're talking, someone asked, breaking into the archery. Do you know any places offering particular internships or positions out of curiosity, or training, or anything like that?
Well, certainly GSN offers internships. It's becoming pretty common. Lots of companies do. Just check their websites. And in terms of training, it's nothing that I'm particularly an expert on, but lots and lots of colleges have training in game art and all sorts of game skills these days. There's one in San Francisco, the Academy of, what's it called, Lawrence?
Academy of Art University?
Yeah, which we get a lot of our artists from. I'm sure there are other similar institutions.
Bristol Community College has a growing game development and game art program. So, yeah. Pittsburgh State.
John Romero said that I should ask you the origin of Leather Goddesses of Phobos.
Okay. I'll answer that if he'll answer the origin of the Q-tip of doom. No, I'll tell the story. It's kind of amusing. So at Infocom, we had just one big central room that was both a conference room and it was also where we had one of every microcomputer. And one entire wall of this room, floor to floor, floor to ceiling, wall to wall, was a chalkboard. And on it, we kept what we called the matrix. And down one side was every game that we had written. And then across the top was every different microcomputer that we supported. So there'd be Apple II, TRS-80, Atari 800, Commodore 64, etc. And then we would write whatever version was sort of the latest in release in the wild on that intersection. So you could say, oh, okay, so, version 84 of Zork 2 is the one that's currently in release on the Commodore 64. Anyway, and one time Infocom was having its first ever party, and it wasn't a big party, it was just like a few dozen area store owners or members of the press kind of coming in and having beer and pizza. But nevertheless, my boss Mark and our president Joel Perez were just like, really kind of hyper that everything come off perfectly. And as they were preparing the party, I snuck into this conference room and added a line to the Matrix entitled Leather Goddesses of Phobos. And just before people arrived, Joel noticed it, and I've never seen him move so fast toward that eraser. But nevertheless, the name just sort of stuck in company lore, and people would, often say things like, what are you going to work on next when this game is done? Oh, Leather Goddesses of Phobos. And at some point I just said, everyone loves that name so much, why don't we actually write Leather Goddesses of Phobos? So we did, yeah. All right, great, we're done. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. That was an awesome talk. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight. We still have food and appetizers in the back. We've got the room till 8:30, so please feel free to hang out and mingle and have a great night. Thank you.